Hi students, I'm going to go over the last couple parts of our review that we would be doing together in class if today wasn't asynchronous. So if you're watching this, hopefully you'll get something out of it. The last things we need to talk about are really systems, which we recently discussed in class, and then ecology, which is usually one of the easier topics. So hopefully this won't be too difficult and it'll go pretty quickly. So for systems, if you're looking at your handout, it's going to ask you for the next couple scenarios which body systems would be interacting to make these processes happen. So if you're running, think about which body systems you would be using or are interacting in your body to make you run. So if we're starting with just the idea, like I have to think about running and something has to tell my body to run, that's your nervous system is responsible for the thinking and the unconscious like movement in your body. So voluntary and involuntary movement starts with the nervous system. And then of course the actual movement, once the nervous system sends signals to your muscles, causes the movement. I would also say that your skeletal system is what's holding you up, and the reason your legs move is because they have a structure then surrounded by the muscles that causes your knee to bend and your foot to flex and relax and stuff. Next one. All right, so food is chewed and swallowed and passed into the stomach where it is broken down into nutrients. The nutrients are then absorbed into the blood in the small intestine and distributed. So what three body systems primarily are interacting in this example? I mean, we could go into a lot, but physically chewing and swallowing is going to take your muscular system. Obviously, your stomach is part of your digestive system. And then your bloodstream, that's your circulatory system that's then going to distribute your nutrients like glucose and amino acids and all that stuff to your other cells in your body. So muscular, the key word here, stomach, nutrients, absorbed is digestive, and then blood is always a keyword for circulatory system. Okay, so there's a breakdown of that. Number 3, or the C, I guess, a virus is inhaled from nearby air and enters the lungs. So keywords here, inhaled, lungs, that must mean respiratory system. Mucus is secreted and traps the virus. T cells destroy the virus. Because we're talking about a pathogen, you can almost guarantee we're talking about our immune system. T cells are a type of cell in your immune system that helps destroy viruses and other pathogens. And then a cough is going to be triggered by your brain to remove the virus and mucus. So really, coughing comes from your respiratory system. We already mentioned respiratory. And then, of course, your brain getting a signal of like an itchiness in your throat, telling your body to cough, is your nervous system. So respiratory, immune, and nervous systems. Another one, I think this one will only have 2 systems we're going to list specifically. Hormones in a female possum are produced that initiate ovulation. Because it's specified female, even if you didn't know the word ovulation and that being related to reproduction, if it's specifying a gender, it's probably talking about reproductive system of some kind. And then hormones are produced by which body system? Your endocrine system. So endocrine and reproductive systems would be the interactions here. If you're going to review body systems, I really just recommend you are very familiar with the functions and look for keywords. So like I pointed out, hormones always mean endocrine. Brain obviously always means nervous system. Blood or blood vessels or heart always means circulatory. So think about things like that when you're reading questions. Okay. Plant systems. So just a real quick review of plant systems. Roots absorb water and nutrients. Obviously, they also anchor plants to the ground. Shoots is everything above the soil. So you have your stems and you have leaves. Stems are used for holding up the plant leaves so they can get sunlight. Leaves are obviously used for collecting sunlight so they can do photosynthesis. Flowers are the main reproductive organs for angiosperms, which is just flowering plants, which is usually what questions are about. We don't talk about other classes or phylums of plants. And then remember the two vessels in the transportation system. So xylem carries water from leaves to roots. And so anything that's going to go up is going to be carried in the xylem. It's mostly water. It could also be hormones. Just plants have hormones too, which help with those tropisms we talked about. But it is primarily water. And then phloem carries food from the leaves to the roots. And again, it could be anything like hormones also, but anything that's going down in a plant is going to go through phloem from leaves to roots. All right. Yeah. What systems of the tomato plant are involved in this interaction? So again, because they have organ systems, plants are going to have system interactions. Sugars are produced in the leaves and transported to the roots. So if we make sure, or the plants make sugar from photosynthesis in the leaves, they have to get to the roots. What systems is going to take care of that? It's going to be the transport system. Basically, plants have what is kind of like our circulatory system with their xylem and phloem. So it's going to be phloem specifically transporting that sugar down. Phloem vessels. Okay, on to ecology. You need to recognize the two kinds of succession and the differences between them. Obviously, remember, succession is rebuilding or sometimes building for the first time an ecosystem. Primary succession is when it happens the first time in a new area that's never been colonized or inhabited before. It'll start usually words like bare rock or bare ground or no diversity, no living things, those kind of keywords. New anything. Oops, sorry. Secondary succession is after some kind of natural disaster. So after a wildfire, after a flood, after any kind of, landslide, tornado, etc. If it damages the ecosystem at all, then it has to regrow or colonate sometimes. So you usually have soil left over. So the main difference is no soil in primary succession. We have to make that soil. We have pioneer species that do that. Secondary succession, there was a climax community, something happened to it, there's soil left over, there's probably seeds and spores and fungus and stuff in the soil, bacteria or insects, larvae. So you don't have to start completely over. So there's more biodiversity in secondary succession than primary, where there's none to start with. So over time, yeah. And as succession starts, whether it's primary or secondary, from beginning to end, you're always going to have higher diversity at the end when you get to your climax community. There should be more different types of species. Common examples of pioneer species, if we're talking about primary succession, are lichens, moss, and then it comes the smaller things like grasses and shrubs like bushes and stuff. And then trees are going to be last. And then, of course, small insects, maybe some small mammals, then larger tertiary organisms, predators and stuff can live once you get the small organisms too. Okay, real quick review of the different types of relationships that occur in ecosystems. So predation obviously is when one species preys on another species for its food source, maybe like wolves eating rabbits. The reason this isn't parasitism is because wolves are killing the rabbits for food on purpose, okay? Competition is when two species are fighting over the same limited resource, whether it's space, whether it's mates, whether it's food, whether it's water. There's lots of different types of resources, but any kind of competition, if they're having to fight each other for it or just like struggling to get it because of the other one also getting it, is competition. So parasitism is when one species benefits from a relationship at the expense of another. So an example of this would be like a mosquito sucking the blood from a human. They're not doing it on purpose to kill us because like we're their prey. That's why it's not predation. But it usually, parasitism can sometimes end up in one species dying, or sometimes it just harms them and they can recover. That's how it's a little different. Commensalism is when one species benefits from the relationship, the other one basically doesn't care. It's not affected, good or bad. So an example is the birds that hang out around cattle, or like in the Sahara with like zebras or rhinos or whatever. Any kind of cattle is going to like graze and kick up insects. Those birds just hang out next to those cattle so that they can catch the grasshoppers that fly up when the cattle like scare them out of the grass, kind of thing. The cattle may not even know that the birds are there or care that the birds are there. They're not losing anything or gaining anything, but the birds are getting an easier meal. And then mutualism is when both species benefit. So bees and flowers are a really good example. Another example would be actually like the bacteria that lives in our colon. We need them to help us digest stuff that our stomachs just can't, like cellulose. But then bacteria also get a place to live and they get some food. So it's beneficial for everybody. So some examples. This would be what kind of relationship? Think about it for a second. If you don't know what a louse is, that's the singular of lice. So if you have lice, they're gonna make you itchy. They can cause your skin some damage and stuff. So this would be parasitism. Hummingbirds feeding on nectar while pollinating flower. Both species, the hummingbird and the flowers, are getting something out of this. So this would be mutualism. Eagle's catching a fish. He's going to eat that fish. He caught that fish so he could eat that fish. So that is predation. Plants in a dense rainforest, they're fighting for water. They're fighting for sunlight, especially. The plants at the bottom are having a harder time getting light than the plants at the top. But there's always a limited resource of light. There's not infinite amount of light every day to go around. So there is some competition here. Here's that example I used, an egret. This is the kind of bird that just hangs out, waiting for insects to get kicked up by the movement of the rhino when he walks in the grass. So the rhino probably doesn't even know the bird's there, or if he does, he doesn't care. He's not being harmed. He's not being helped. So this is commensalism. Okay, very quick review. You guys have been learning this stuff for a long time. So producers make food. They're at the bottom of the food pyramid or a food chain. Like if we were writing up, down, like maybe we'll see a picture in a minute. Consumers eat other organisms. They cannot make their own foods. Then there's different types of consumers. You have primary, the ones that eat producers. You have secondary, the ones that eat primary consumers. Then you have tertiary, the ones that eat secondary consumers. Keep in mind that in different food chains, an organism like this fox could be secondary in this food chain, but he might be tertiary in another food chain where something he eats something that eats producers. So just keep in mind, it's different depending on the ecosystem sometimes. Okay, so here's a food pyramid. Obviously, energy source is the sun. Producers get the most energy because they're getting it directly from the sun. But then after all the processes are said and done, and they've done photosynthesis, and they've used the energy they need and stored it for their purposes, they have 10% of what's left, what they got to offer to consumers, primary consumers who might eat them. And so then again, once primary consumers eat some grass, they're only going to have, after everything's said and done, after they use some energy, it's released as heat, etc., they're going to have 10% of that energy to offer a secondary consumer who gets to eat them. And then the same thing here. So every level gets only 10% of the level before it. So if we put numbers on this, if this was 1,000,000 joules of energy available here, then primary consumers only get 100,000 joules of energy. And if they have 100,000 joules of energy, secondary consumers have access to 10,000 joules of energy. So you lose a zero every time, or you move your decimal point. Okay, this is a food web. Like I said before, there's different food chains in a food web. So here we have this plant gets eaten by this grasshopper. This is a primary consumer. That makes the snake secondary in this food chain, and the hawk tertiary. But in this food chain, we have the plant, primary consumer, secondary consumer, tertiary consumer, quaternary consumer, okay? So the snake is secondary and tertiary depending on which food chain we follow, so keep that in mind. Organisms let's go back. Organisms at the bottom have the most energy and they have the most biomass because they have the most access to energy. You have to have energy to produce cells to have biomass, okay? That's what this is talking about. So the most biomass is going to be plants. Second most would be primary consumers like these guys. Then secondary like these guys, and tertiary like him. All right, that's it, guys. I hope this was helpful. Do the practice questions and see how you do. Bye.